everyone. Thanks for joining the Artistic Vision podcast. My name is Gary Ball. My co-host, Alex Sossler, is on the road right now as I film this intro, but he'll be joining the podcast. Today, we are interviewing Dr. Natalie Carnes. She is at Baylor University in Texas and has written a couple of really great books in the last few years. One that particularly catches my attention is Beauty, which is a theological engagement with Gregory of Nyssa. She's also written a recent book, Attunement, the Art and Politics of Feminist Theology. And so she comes with amazing credentials. She studied at Harvard and Chicago and Duke before taking on her role at Baylor. So super smart, and we've learned a lot from her over the years of reading and engaging with her work, but also really enjoy this interview, and we know you will too. So check this out.
All right, welcome to the Artistic Vision, a podcast on theology and the arts. And today we have Natalie Carnes. Thanks for being here.
Really delighted to be here, Alex. Thanks for inviting me on.
Got it. The first question we ask all of our guests is, what is your background with beauty or your beginning of beauty? So some people are raised in homes where the artistic, the poetic matters. Others kind of arrive later in life. And you've kind of made a career of theology and the arts. So how did that begin for you?
Yeah. Well, I did grow up in a home that valued the arts. My mom was an artist, and her mom was an artist, and my youngest sister is an artist. So I definitely grew up valuing the arts. And so I think that maybe attuned me to the importance of the arts and the aesthetics. But like one of my pivotal moments for me as like a growing person in the world, I guess, was an undergraduate. I was in this course on Cappadocian theology with a person who was then known as Dr. Nicholas Constas, now Father Maximus Constas. And we were reading the life of Moses, and he had us, every class, we had to sort of write a response paper. And among the ways we responded was we gave 3 different questions that we wanted to ask the author, with the ways that we would continue the conversation. And I was the only undergraduate in this class, so I always remember feeling like a bit overwhelmed by the kind of learning of the graduate students who knew so much more theory and things than I did, and I was always trying to catch up. But in reading Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses, the thing that struck me was the way beauty was like a force in his text, was like beauty was what called him up the mountain. And I was reading these, I was in other classes where I was doing sort of postmodern theory and hermeneutics, and we were learning a lot about aesthetics in that class, and they were also very central in that class. But the way Gregory talked about it was both resonant and also very different, where beauty had this personality. I mean, beauty was a name for God. And so my very simple question was, what does Gregory mean by beauty? And in the lecture, my professor, Dr. Constas, singled out that question and said, in some ways, that is the question. And so that moment just sort of stayed with me. And it's not like I was like, I'm going to figure it out now. This is my life quest. But it kept coming back to me. And when it was time to write a dissertation, as much as I journeyed away into different questions, that question came back to me as the one that continued to sort of have me in its grip in a way.
That's great. Yeah, I was going to ask about motherhood now, but it seems like the next best question is about Nyssa. So let's talk a little bit about Nyssa. You wrote a book kind of on this topic of what you're talking about, what beauty means to Gregory of Nyssa, which you characterize beauty in the book as fittingness and gratuity, but also resistance. What do you mean by those terms, and why did you choose Gregory of Nyssa to explore that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I wanted a way of thinking about beauty that took seriously all the ways that beauty has been destructively, the way that beauty was something that Nazis valued. Beauty is something that's been sort of used in the oppression of women and the oppression of people of color. And so in doing a kind of theological retrieval of beauty, I also wanted to be attentive to all the ways our life with beauty goes awry. And so how do you think about beauty in a way that accounts for that? Both the way that it can reveal God and the way that it can sort of implicate you in the fallenness of the world. And so fittingness and gratuity was one way of doing that, where something becomes fitting, something becomes beautiful to you because you perceive its fittingness in a particular context. Fittingness is like got a very long history in Christian theology as far as thinking about, God's work in the world. And we think about God's work in the world in terms of what it would be fitting for God to do. And our understandings of fittingness are then revised in light of what God does. So fittingness has this long history being a theological term, a way that we think about who God is and what God does in the world. And it also just a way of thinking about particular contexts and settings. So if you are thinking about the way that if you were formed into a kind of problematic ideology, then what you see as fitting is going to be determined by and reflect that kind of ideology. So in different settings, you can perceive different things as beautiful. And also the beauty of something can unfold when given different kinds of conceptual frames, right? So you can look at a particular artwork and see that it's beautiful, and then you can contextualize that within the work that artwork, let's say, does in a community. And let's say this artwork is a beautiful piece of architecture, a building, and that building was used then to displace a whole neighborhood of people who had generations of lives there and family connections, and it disrupted that community order to be in place. And so you might, given this different kinds of context, see that the building, while beautiful in one respect, perhaps to these kind of formal elements of architecture, might in fact be quite unbeautiful in another respect. So I appreciated the flexibility that fittingness gives. And gratuity kind of arises from that, because of course, something that's beautiful is not just fitting. It's not like, oh, it just fits this purpose, but it exceeds any sort of purpose that you might put to it. It's exceedingly fitting. And so gratuity captures the way that kind of like overflowing character of beauty. And resistance can be understood in relationship to that, the kind of flexibility of fittingness, that depending on the kinds of contexts and that you're putting to beauty and that you're formed in, beauty can then have a real resistance to yourself, to the kind of fallenness in our world, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I like the way that it confronts our aversion to the word function. I think in the arts, even the way if something is beautiful only because it functions in a particular way, almost like it's serving us or we're assigning it meaning, as opposed to its fittingness and looking at it and seeing the way that it serves where it is. Regardless of the way that we experience it, it has a beauty that goes beyond even the way that we use it. So I appreciated that that part of it. One thing that struck me, well, a lot of things struck me about beauty, but I love the part on page 59 where you talk about how we are trained to see beauty. You talk about beauty is sometimes self-evident. It draws us to God just because it's self-evidently attractive, but also coming to perceive that we also have to come to perceive it. I think more prominently, maybe Gregory talks about it in that way. So then you ask, where does the training into beauty begin? I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how are we trained to perceive beauty according to Gregory?
Gary, that's a great question. That's a really great question. For him, like the kind of liturgy is a really important place where we are trained into perceiving beauty. And also he uses his homilies as occasions for training people into beauty. One of my, like, some of my favorite texts of Gregory that I go back to again and again are his famine sermons. And this is when a great famine's hit Cappadocia, and he's trying to help his churchgoers to see the starving that's in their midst. So he's using his homily in this really complex and beautiful way where he's painting these scenes of the starving among them and erasing them and then painting them again and then erasing them again, as he's trying to help them to see the starving among them, the way that hunger has ravaged and them, to give them a fate akin to the beasts among them. But he doesn't want them to see them as beasts. He wants them to see them as glorious bearers of the image of God. So then he repaints them as glorious bearers of the image of God that need to be treated with dignity and respect. But he doesn't want that to like keep us from being able to see what it is, how it is hunger has ravaged their lives. And he doesn't want them to become spectacles. So he also paints the picture of like the kind of greedy or gluttonous ones, which he would define as anyone who is refusing to share their food with the one who is in need, and the ways that the lives that the gluttonous ones are leading, that is sort of blocking them from the lives of the needy who would make a claim upon their wealth, and paints the kind of ugliness of that form of living, and is directing us in the sermon, us, the ones who are hearing the sermons, into the beauty of mercy, the beauty of where the kind of the forms of need, of spiritual need and of physical need meet one another in an act of, and that's where sort of beauty lies. It's in that act of mercy that is mutually healing. And I think that sermon is a sort of beautiful pedagogy to his congregants and to us who are reading it today, to try to learn how to see need among us in a way that doesn't spectacleize it, that sees the beauty, but also has, these multiple contexts where it can also see the kind of ravage that it's done to a life.
Yeah. It seems that he also refers to spiritual reading almost as an exercise of being able to then, something that is carried over into our vision of the world. That if we're reading the way that Nyssa reads the Bible in an imaginative way, in a way that is looking for Jesus, that by practicing that, even in the way that we read the Bible, feels like it's training our eyes for the way that we see the world. Would you characterize that in a similar way? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that that's lovely. Yeah, part of what this, like Gregory is part of this whole, sometimes the Alexandrian school of exegesis, where they have this kind of contemplative reading of scripture. I really appreciate it because not only are you always seeking Jesus, not only are you always learning to be alive and attentive to the way that Christ is moving in this text and therefore in this world, in a way that there's not this line between text and world in the same way, because it's all occasions for being able to see Christ. But it also gives us a way of knowing what to do with our impulses when we read scripture and you're like, that doesn't sound right. There's these moments where you're like, God, it seems like you're showing favoritism, or like, why destroy these people? Those are really hard texts. And sometimes the scholars, our tendency can be, well, like, let me like use what I've learned of, historical critical methodology to sort of distance myself from it and tidy it up and move beyond it. I mean, that's one thing that we can do. But the beauty of this is that, Gregory of Nyssa knew that there were texts that, where God did things that seem super problematic. And Origen knew that, that we've known that for centuries as Christians. And that moment where you feel yourself in this alienated relationship to the text becomes an invitation into deeper contemplation of like, well, what else is going on there? Where can we seek Jesus? And so it's also this pedagogy of seeking Jesus, not just in the kind of obvious connections of the wood is the cross or something, but even in like, well, God, like, why did you flood the whole world? Like, the story of like Noah's Ark that we paint on children's bedrooms is a horrifying story. And and the kind of contemplation of that text in early Christianity led some of these early interpreters to see it as a story of baptism, and the ways that it's a story about how it is God wipes away and washes away the wickedness in our hearts. So anyway, that's just an example of how we don't flee from the difficulties of the world, or when we perceive something that seems ugly or unfitting, we don't sort of have to box it away and distance ourselves from it, but use it as an invitation to go deeper and trust that God will help us to find Christ in that text too.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're at our church, we're teaching through Exodus in the spiritual formation hour, and we're kind of using Nyssa or Gregory of Nyssa for a
Okay.
spiritual reading, kind of like underlying kind of our
Mm.
beginning conversations. But this week is the death of the firstborn, and if there's anything that's hard, I mean, that's wiping out a whole generation seems difficult read and justification. But yeah, I love that those are opportunities for contemplation.
Yeah.
I like that.
How is that working with your church? How's that going? As reading Gregory of Nyssa as a way to read Exodus, are people into it, or is it weird for them?
I think it is it's definitely not normal, right? I mean, I think all of us are trained in like kind of the historical, grammatical, what is the meaning of this text? Explain it to me, help me understand it. And so I kind of, we talk about questions we have, the text, and then we kind of get to, well, what do you think would be kind of the deepest level of this the spiritual reading? And so I kind of function as I kind of like just lob it out there and say, this is what Nyssa says. What do we think about it? And so I think it's an invitational way to think like you agree or disagree, but this is how one of our church fathers read what's going on here. And it's a way for us to help us understand it as well. But I do like that, like when you encounter that alienation, when you encounter that roadblock that's a way to attend to it differently.
Yeah. I think where a lot of people, if you're simply reading it historically, would find themselves in a position of despair. Like you either have to follow Marcion or explain it. And so like if you can explain it, like where's the spiritual in that totally, but it's actually, I think, enlivened them and given them a model for how to read the Bible in a way that doesn't leave you in despair. It doesn't make you have to explain it, and you don't have to dismiss it. It's really
Absolutely.
beautiful.
Yeah. I like that. An antidote to despair. That's beautiful.
I want to get to how this affects, like, if you were going to kind of talk to artists about how Nyssa's vision of beauty could help them. I mean, I think this is great for like me. I'm not really an artist, right? Or spiritual formation generally, and I want to get there. But I want to, before we get there, another kind of theory question, which is, you alluded to this a few times, but how does the cross, like the most ugly event of the world, reinterpret our vision of beauty? Because you have another line that says, love that makes God visible is care-filled attention to holiness, which I think is beautiful in a lot of different ways. But yeah, speak on that, the attention to the cross actually being a paradigm of beauty when it is grotesque.
Yeah, thank you. Well, there's a way in which, I mean, it's not like on the cross, God's character suddenly changes and we get like a new picture of God. It's in a way deeply continuous with who God always is, that God is always the one going out to what is not God. That is who God is in creation. That's who God is in incarnation. And then in the cross, that's who God is under the conditions of a fallen world. That's what we see is God going out to what is not God. God being near to kind of suffering, the conditions of sin in the world. So in a way, I want to see the cross as deeply continuous with the person that we've always known God to be, who we've always known God to be. And yet grappling what it means to be this God who goes out under the conditions of sin is a new thing. It's new in that, I mean, it's conceptually different than reflecting on who God is as the creator or who God is even just in the incarnation with itself. That contemplating who God is under the conditions of sin in the crucifixion reveals to us a kind of intimacy, beauty with suffering under the conditions of sin in the world. And so I think it challenges us. Not that every sort of piece of art needs to be about suffering or sin or redemption, even. That if we are trying to find beauty and the places we're seeking for beauty are places that we've sort of sanitized from the suffering of the world, or they're places that are deflections from the sin of the world, then we're probably being formed into problematic pictures of beauty. It's probably not the picture of beauty that's revealed to us on the cross. Yeah, and I think when I was writing beauty, I had a really I was more on the side of the discontinuity between the cross or the cross and the resurrection. And I think I now see a more of a continuity between the cross and the resurrection, and therefore the cross may be in all the Christian story, in that what we see on the cross is God's infinite, impassable, unchanging love. And we see what that love looks like under the conditions of the worst kinds of things humanity could throw at it, what that love looks like under the conditions of torture and death. And that even under those conditions, the God who is love never turns from God's own perfect character as the one who is love itself. And so in that way, the cross is already a kind of foreshadow of the resurrection. There's already a kind of victory in that, a love that is undefeated by death and violence and torture. And so, yeah, so I see the cross as also just like deeply revelatory of the power of God's own love, and the way that that love is not determined by anything other than God's own character as love. And so care-filled attention to that kind of love, I think, is reforms the entire way that we see the world.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I know you wrote, well, the book came out 10 years ago, and you probably wrote it 12 years ago. So thanks for going down memory lane with us a little bit, talking about
Yeah,
Gregory of
well,
Nyssa.
thanks for reminding me.
Why don't you go on, Alex? Should we talk about attunement?
Yeah, I want to get to motherhood first because it's one of my, I don't know how well it's known, but I haven't heard people talk about it. And so I think it's underrated because in it, so your position is that one of a constructive theologian. And so I'd love for you just to define, like, what does it mean to be a constructive theologian? We'll start there.
Yeah. So, yeah, thanks. It's interesting how in theology we sometimes veer towards the term systematic theologian and sometimes constructive theologian. I prefer constructive because I'm not very systematic. And I think that constructive gets at the way that there is an element of creativity that is involved in the theological process, that in one way we're saying something that's quite old, and in one way, we're always saying something new, because this gift of revelation we've been given has to be re-received and reinterpreted under the conditions of a new age that has a new relationship to different kinds of symbols, new concerns driving it. And so this act that a theologian is trying to perform of interpreting the the gift of Christian revelation to a new people requires all the resources of any kind of creative act. It is an act where you are constructing something or making something new. And I think that there can be a real anxiety in some parts of the theological world or the church about newness and about creativity. I know sometimes my students are like, new? We're not supposed to be saying new things now, are we? And so one of the things I try to remind them of is, you know, there's disanalogies in what I'm saying, but in the fourth century, for example, and a lot of Christian history, it's the architects of the heresy, the heresiarchs, that are the ones that are so worried about saying a new thing. That it was the ones who became orthodox. The Cappadocians were the ones who are wanting to say homoousios, consubstantial, right? That Christ is consubstantial to the Father, and it was really people on the other side of the debate that were like, I don't know about this word. This sounds like something that is naming a new kind of relationship to God that seems problematic in ways. And so anyway, God doing and saying a new thing is part of the Christian story because we believe in a spirit who makes all things new. So I hear the disanalogies because different churches have different relationships to how God continues to make doctrine today. But there, even if you don't believe that new doctrine is being made today, for doctrine, even old doctrines, to still have the same kind of claim on us, we have to allow them to be reconstructed, to be said in new ways, to be interpreted in new ways, and to be even sort of imagined in different kinds of ways.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, otherwise it's just theology becomes memorization.
Well, right. I mean, it was at Pelican who said something like tradition is the living faith of the dead, and traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. So in order to sort of retrieve tradition and not become traditionalists, there's an element of newness we have to be able to embrace.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that idea with theology too. Like it is an element of creativity that is necessary to make good theological sentences in books and theology. So on that note, then, you wrote this book, Motherhood, which in maybe simplistic terms is if Augustine wrote Confessions, but Augustine was a female. Is that fair?
Yeah, and a mother.
Yeah. And right, I think if I remember correctly, you becoming a mother kind of made you kind of consider the different ways of reading Augustine and the challenges that he is and the gift that he is. How did that book form in your mind, and what are you hoping that book does in the world?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I teach Augustine's Confessions almost every semester. Every time I teach Intro to Theology, it's one of the texts that I sort of thread through the course. And it's one that the students respond to almost as much as any other text because it's a story and because it's about the transformations of desires and things that they can relate to. And I love it for that reason. And it's just so beautiful. I love, one of the first things we do with it is just take the first paragraph and just go through and find its symmetries and its parallelisms and the dense theologies in it. And yet it also really frustrates me because I find it just so, depending on my mood, I would just so small-minded or silly about certain things. One of the silly things being like the nursing infant that he finds like emblematic of original sin for how much milk the greedy infant wants. And then just how, despite the prominence of Monica, his mother, women in general are not fully human characters in the text of the Confessions, and that they're often female flesh is the figuration of sin that runs throughout the Confessions. And so I always sort of worry, like, am I also passing along this misogyny to my students at the same time that I'm passing on this great theology? And, since teaching that text while being at Baylor, I've also have 3 daughters and I've been raising them. And so I was at this point where I finished my tenure book and I'd had this book just welling in me for a while, welling up in me of like, I've been thinking about the Confessions and thinking about like, I just been living with it for so long, every semester going back to it, and every semester also at the same time raising my daughters who were, 2 of them were born during that time period and they were growing. And so the text is like just writing it. The first draft was just the fastest thing I'd ever written. It was basically, I turned in my tenure book and within a few weeks I had this draft. And then I like revised it for a couple of years. But the actual text, it was sort of like a birthing process in and of itself, just me sort of negotiating this life with the Confessions and my life with my daughters, and the book was sort of the result of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that. Right. Confession is probably my favorite book of all time. And you're critical of it, but in your critique of it, it made me actually appreciate it more. And I think like what constructive theology can do is like, there's problematic things, there's troublesome things, there's alienating things. But just because they're there doesn't mean we need to dismiss all of it. And that if you are invited into a deeper contemplation, you can see the beauty of it, going back to that.
Well, exactly. I mean, and this is probably part of the problem of being a feminist in the Christian tradition is almost all of our artifacts are patriarchal. So what do you do as a feminist in a tradition that's riddled with patriarchal texts and artifacts? Well, one is just to continue to occupy a position of alienation, and another is to try to remake these artifacts in a way to co-create them into a more hospitable inheritance for the next generation.
Back to Nyssa a little bit, but also in your work. So we've kind of talked about like what I said before, like the spiritual formation of this view of beauty for everybody. But if you're going to maybe target an artistic audience, those who do create art, how do you think Nyssa or Gregory of Nyssa's vision of beauty, I keep on saying Nyssa, like that's his last name, I'm sorry. But how does that vision of beauty connect to or influence or disciple artists?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't think it's going to be I think broader principles, but I would say one is this kind of embrace of what I take it all art is, which is the materiality of art is presenting to us more than its materiality. So it's the wood and the paint, the canvas and the paint. What they present to us is an image that is more than the wood and the paint or the paint, right? Its art is always giving us more than its material existence. And in that way, art itself is kind of analogous to a sacrament in the way that what a sacrament is that it's more than its material, literal existence. And in that way, a sacrament is like a distilled version of what all of creation is. And art sort of makes visible that for us. I mean, and Gregory is just, and one way you could think of him as an artist practicing that with his own sort of interpretation of scripture is taking these words and these symbols and showing how they're more than their own literal existence. So in one way, he's a fellow artist who's showing us something about what art is. I think that his vision of the cross is also, and how he thinks about like those riddled with famine in Cappadocia, for example, is a real challenge to think about the God who is beauty in relationship to the great problems and suffering of our time, right? That sometimes theology and the arts can become a kind of refuge from the difficulties of reality. And instead of, I think Gregory challenges us to see beauty and the arts as ways into the difficulties of reality, ways of reforming ourselves and rethinking and reframing these difficulties, inviting us into a different kind of relationship with them. Another way that Gregory's vision of beauty might speak to artists today, well, maybe just by, I think so much of what Gregory did was, even in his writing, when it's done by an individual, it's with and for a community. And I think artists deeply need communities. And so maybe there's like a challenge to artists today to seek communities of people with whom you want to be formed as you pursue your particular artistic vision.
That's great. Final question. I know I want to ask about Attunement, your newest book. I want to keep talking all day, but final question we ask, and if you want to plug what you're doing and what you're excited about, please do as well. But the final question we ask is kind of giving you the last word. What would you want to communicate to artists who are Christian or artists in the church?
Yeah. That is, thank you for that question. I mean, I guess I would want them to pick up on that Nicenian challenge, challenge from Gregory of Nyssa, to nurture an art that speaks deeply to the gifts given to the church and also to the situation of the church and that we find ourselves in today. One of the things that I'm working on right now is I'm finishing a draft of the manuscript co-written with my husband on poverty in art and how it is Christians can justify making and supporting the art in a world where people die of unmet need. And it's thinking about how it is to be an artist is a vocation different than a vocation to, for example, voluntary poverty or to a life of corporal works of mercy. And yet in Christianity, we believe that gifts aren't the same thing as like a division of labor where you take care of art and I'll take care of poverty, but instead our charisms are meant to mutually inform one another. So as you seek communities by which you might be formed, think about those communities as including artists and also maybe in the same community, maybe in a different community, as including people who do feel themselves called to a kind of life committed to the corporal works of mercy. And then the other related to the Attunement project, part of the role that I see for artists is in having this role as maybe constructive theologians is too logocentric, but artists is having a role in helping to renew the Christian witness in a way that forms a kind of more hospitable center to the Christian church. I'm very interested in the history of feminist theology, which begins in the realization that the battles for gender equality are fought and won in the symbolic imagination. We've got to talk about metaphor and symbol and image, and all of those were like early themes in feminist theology in a time when they weren't in the rest of the theological world. And a lot of feminist theologians, the pioneers now, are like writing novels and memoirs and doing weird kind of creative things, which I think is kind of continuous with this artistic impulse. And I think it's because a lot of where the Christian theological work is done is not just in the kind of writing of theological treatises, but in mediating the Christian story anew, various forms of art. And so you artists are part of mediating that story. And so I guess I exhort you and commend you to that vocation and to take it seriously, because it's important for those of us who are just doing the writing work of theology as well.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing with us. Man, it's a rich conversation that I know I'll be thinking about for a while. So thanks for your time and thanks for your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you for your thoughtful questions. It's really fun.